Welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be looking closely at those excerpts you shared from A Crisis of Meaning, How Gay Men Are Making Sense of AIDS.
Yeah.
This book is powerful stuff.
It is.
It's about finding meaning in the face of unimaginable loss, and it's told through the very personal stories of gay men living with HIV in those early years of the crisis.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a powerful book.
Yeah.
The author, Steven Schwartzberg, is a clinical psychologist,
Mm-hmm.
and he conducted these really in-depth interviews.
Yeah.
And what he captures is so much more than just the medical side of things.
Right.
He really delves into the human struggle to understand suffering and loss, and ultimately how we find meaning when our world feels like it's falling apart.
I mean, the book opens with a story about a man named Robbie, who was the first person that Schwartzberg knew who died from AIDS.
Yeah.
And it's such a powerful story. Have you ever experienced a loss that just made you question everything?
Well, yeah.
Like the ground was pulled out from under you? That's what this story felt like. It's like deeply personal, but also speaking to a universal experience of grief.
Yeah. Schwartzberg compares the AIDS epidemic to wartime devastation.
Wow.
The scale of the loss,
Uh-huh.
the fear, the constant uncertainty. It just forces you to confront some really, really difficult questions.
Yeah,
Like, why is this happening?
right.
Is there any meaning to this suffering?
Yeah, I'm starting to understand what Schwartzberg means by this crisis of meaning.
Yeah.
It's not just about coping with a disease,
Right.
It's about coping with a fundamental shift in your understanding of the world.
Exactly. The things that you once relied on to make sense of the world crumble.
Yeah.
Your beliefs, your sense of security, the idea that life is fair,
Right.
they just fall apart.
Wow.
And there's even a psychological concept for this.
Okay.
They call it the just world hypothesis,
Yeah.
which is this belief that people get what they deserve.
Okay.
But when you're faced with something like the AIDS epidemic,
Yeah.
this idea just completely falls apart.
Right.
And so you had people grappling with questions of why me,
Yeah.
trying to understand their illness in a world that suddenly felt incredibly unjust and chaotic.
I imagine that that's where Schwartzberg's four styles of adaptation come in.
Right.
Yeah, he's not saying there's a right or wrong way to react to this crisis, but rather he's identifying patterns in how these men coped with this enormous upheaval.
Right. He called them transformation, rupture, camouflage, and impassivity.
Okay.
And they're not rigid categories,
Gotcha.
but more like guideposts to understand these different ways that people try to find their footing amidst all of this uncertainty.
I'm curious about this idea of transformation.
Yeah.
It sounds almost counterintuitive, like that someone could find growth and meaning in the midst of such devastation.
Right.
It's not about pretending everything is okay, is it?
No, not at all.
Mhm.
It's about acknowledging the pain, the loss, the fear, and finding a way to integrate that experience into your understanding of yourself and the world.
Mm-hmm.
Schwartzberg tells the story of Anthony,
Okay.
who was a librarian who had been living with HIV for 9 years when he was interviewed.
Wow.
And despite everything, he had found solace in his work,
Okay.
in his spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
He was Catholic and was active in Alcoholics Anonymous.
Wow.
And acceptance of suffering became a central part of his life.
That's an incredible story, to find that kind of acceptance, to
Yeah.
see suffering as a path to growth.
Right.
It just makes you wonder what we can learn from his example.
Hmm.
How can we apply this idea of finding meaning in suffering to our own lives?
It's a profound question, and I think it's one of the core takeaways from this book.
Yeah.
Because even if the challenges that we face are different, this human search for meaning is something that we all grapple with.
Okay, so we have transformation on one end of the spectrum, but what about rupture?
Yeah.
That seems to represent the opposite experience.
Your rupture is about feeling utterly shattered,
Okay.
overwhelmed by grief and a sense of meaninglessness. The world feels chaotic and unpredictable, and the old ways of understanding life simply don't apply anymore.
Is there a story from the book that really captures that experience of rupture?
Yeah, Ron's story is incredibly poignant. He had lost his partner, Robert,
Mm-hmm.
and was consumed by grief.
Yeah.
And his faith, which had once been a source of comfort, offered little solace in the face of AIDS.
Wow.
Ron felt cheated, like AIDS was stealing time that rightfully belonged to him and Robert. He kept saying, it just shouldn't be.
Wow. I can hear the disbelief in his words, the anger at the injustice of it all.
Yeah.
Did Ron ever find a way to make sense of his loss?
Well, That's an important question, and it gets to the heart of how these styles of adaptation weren't fixed or static.
Right.
People could move between them over time. Remember, Schwartzberg interviewed these men at a specific moment in their lives.
Right.
And their understanding of AIDS and their own journey
Yeah.
could change drastically as the crisis unfolded.
It's a good reminder. So we've explored transformation and rupture, but there are two other styles, right?
Right.
What about camouflage and impassivity?
Right.
How did those play out in the book?
Camouflage is a fascinating one.
Okay.
It's this precarious balance of denial and acceptance.
Okay.
So think of it as presenting a positive facade while struggling with this intense fear and anxiety underneath.
It's like trying to project an image of strength and resilience.
Right.
But deep down, you're battling these overwhelming emotions.
Exactly. Francis, one of the men that Schwartzberg interviewed, embodies this style perfectly.
Okay.
He had this fight and deny approach, emphasizing personal control and just downplaying the risks of AIDS.
Okay.
He was all about taking care of himself, believing that he could somehow outsmart the disease.
Right.
But you could just sense this fragility beneath the surface,
Yeah.
this vulnerability that he was trying to mask.
Almost like he was trying to convince himself that he had control.
Right.
When the reality was far more uncertain.
That's precisely.
Yeah.
And then you have impassivity,
Okay.
which is characterized by emotional detachment, a minimal reaction to the crisis.
Given the magnitude of what was happening, it's hard to imagine being that detached.
Yeah.
But I guess it speaks to the spectrum of human response, the different ways we cope with trauma.
Absolutely. Schwartzberg tells a story of Sam,
Okay.
who just seemed resigned to his diagnosis, almost indifferent.
Yeah.
He said that he could just deny, and that doesn't bother me at all.
Wow.
So it's a stark contrast to Anthony's journey of transformation,
Right.
but it highlights how there is no single right way to cope.
Yeah. So we have these four distinct styles, each representing a different way of grappling with the crisis of meaning. But Schwartzberg goes even deeper, right?
He does.
He identifies 10 common representations or ways of thinking about and understanding HIV/AIDS.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's fascinating how these representations just reveal the different lenses through which people try to make sense of this epidemic.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me about these representations.
Okay, well, he describes HIV as a challenge, an enemy, a loss punishment, a teacher, a gift.
Wow.
And he also talks about it as a confirmation of powerlessness, contamination, isolation, and belonging.
Okay.
And each of these is illustrated through the stories of these men.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. So many different ways of framing this one experience.
Yeah.
I'm particularly curious about HIV as punishment because we talked earlier about the just world hypothesis,
Right.
That need to find cause and effect, even if it means blaming yourself.
That's a really perceptive observation. And you see this idea of punishment surface even in the men who outwardly rejected it.
Right.
Like Francis, despite his emphasis on control and denial, still harbored this underlying belief that maybe his illness was a consequence of his past behavior,
Right.
particularly his earlier promiscuity.
It's like even if you intellectually understand that HIV isn't a punishment,
Right.
there's still this part of you that wants to make sense of it, to find a reason why this is happening.
It speaks to the complexity of this crisis of meaning.
Yeah.
These men were trying to reconcile their beliefs with this seemingly random and devastating event.
Right.
And sometimes that meant seeking an explanation, even if it led back to self-blame.
Okay, so HIV as punishment is one way of understanding it, but you also mentioned HIV as belonging,
Right.
which seems like a completely different perspective.
It is. And it's a powerful example of how some men found a sense of community and connection
Okay.
within the gay community as a result of HIV. They saw themselves as part of a shared struggle, a collective experience that transcended individual differences.
Instead of isolation and fear, they found solidarity and purpose.
Right.
Were there any stories that particularly resonated with you in terms of this idea of HIV as belonging?
Craig's story is a great example. He said, what there is to be made sense of and to be proud of is the reaction to it, and to learn from that. On the whole, gay people have responded brilliantly. We've developed support networks, support groups to raise money and dispense caring to people who need it. We've learned how to deal with our own bereavement on the whole as a people by insisting on a future, by celebrating life.
It really is. It's about finding strength in community, in shared grief, in collective action. It's inspiring to see how even in the face of such immense suffering, these men found a way to forge connections and create meaning.
Exactly. These men weren't just coping with a disease, they were coping with a fundamental shift in their world.
Right.
Their identities, their very understanding of life and death.
It just gives me a much deeper understanding of this crisis of meaning.
Yeah.
It's so much more than the medical aspects of AIDS. It's about how we as humans make sense of life and loss and the things we hold dear.
You're absolutely right. And it makes you wonder, how did these men actually cope with the day-to-day realities of their illness?
Right.
What strategies could they use to navigate a disease that at the time felt like a death sentence?
That's a good question. We've talked about the different ways that they framed HIV/AIDS in their minds.
Right.
But how did that translate into actual coping mechanisms?
Yeah.
Did Schwartzberg offer any insights on that?
He did. And it's fascinating how his perspective as a clinician comes into play here.
Okay.
He talks about this crucial distinction between what he calls problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the difference between those two approaches?
Well, problem-focused coping is all about taking action, trying to exert control over the situation.
Okay.
It's about seeking solutions, finding ways to manage the practical challenges of living with HIV.
Yeah.
Emotion-focused coping, on the other hand, is about acknowledging and processing the emotional impact of the crisis.
So it's like problem-focused is about what you do, and emotion-focused is about how you feel.
Exactly. And Schwartzberg emphasizes that both are essential. It's not about choosing one over the other. It's about finding a balance that works for you.
So in the context of AIDS, what would some examples of problem-focused coping look like?
Well, seeking out medical treatment is a big one.
Right.
Staying informed about the latest research and advancements. Making lifestyle changes to support your immune system.
Right.
Taking steps to protect yourself from further infection.
Okay.
These are all ways of taking control, of not letting the disease completely dictate your life.
It's about being proactive.
Yes.
About being an active participant in your own well-being, even when you're facing a serious illness.
Exactly. And then on the emotional side, you have things like finding support groups, talking to a therapist,
Right.
engaging in spiritual practices, journaling, expressing yourself through art.
Yeah.
These are all ways of processing the fear, the grief, the uncertainty that inevitably comes with living with HIV.
It's about recognizing the emotional reality of the situation and finding healthy ways to cope.
Right. And this brings us back to that theme of control that we talked about earlier. While problem-focused coping is about exerting control over external factors.
Right.
Emotion-focused coping is about recognizing that some things are beyond our control.
Yeah.
And finding ways to manage our inner world.
It's about finding that sweet spot between agency and acceptance.
Yeah.
Between fighting and letting go, which, when I think about it, is relevant to so many challenges that we face in life.
Absolutely.
Not just AIDS. Have you ever struggled with finding that balance in your own life?
Absolutely. I think it's something that we all grapple with in different ways.
Yeah.
And Schwartzberg makes a really compelling point about how crucial it is to find that balance.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with something as complex and challenging as AIDS.
Because if you're constantly trying to control things that are beyond your reach,
Right.
you're setting yourself up for frustration and despair.
Right. And that can lead to unhealthy coping mechanisms, like using drugs or alcohol to numb the pain, or engaging in risky behaviors that could further jeopardize your health.
Yeah.
Schwartzberg talks about how these kinds of coping mechanisms ultimately undermine your well-being and hinder growth. They might offer a temporary escape,
Right.
but they don't address the underlying issues.
It's like those coping mechanisms become problems in themselves,
Right.
adding another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where Schwartzberg's insight as a therapist really shines through.
Yeah.
He argues that true healing and change begin with acceptance, not denial.
Wow.
It's about facing the reality of your situation, however difficult it may be, and then finding ways to move forward.
It's about acknowledging the pain without letting it consume you.
Right.
It makes me think about the different ways these men tried to make sense of their diagnosis, how they searched for explanations, even if it meant blaming themselves.
That's a great connection.
Yeah.
Because ultimately finding meaning is about confronting those difficult questions,
Right.
those uncomfortable truths. And sometimes that involves accepting things we don't fully understand.
This is bringing up so many questions for me.
Yeah.
Like, how do you balance that need for meaning with the reality that sometimes there are no easy answers? And how do you hold on to hope when faced with something as devastating as AIDS?
Those are great questions. And they lead us to another fascinating aspect of Schwartzberg's book, his exploration of the power of illusion and the importance of honesty.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. An illusion in the context of something as serious as AIDS.
Right.
That seems almost counterintuitive.
I know. It seems strange.
Yeah.
But Schwartzberg makes this really compelling argument that illusions can actually be beneficial,
Okay.
especially when you're facing adversity. They can provide hope and motivation, a sense of purpose.
So it's not about denying reality altogether.
Right.
It's about finding ways to maintain a sense of hope even when things are tough.
Exactly. He shares this story about a patient. He had a woman who was convinced that she was a famous concert pianist,
Okay.
even though there was no evidence to support it.
So she was delusional.
Well, you could say that. But Schwartzberg realized that this illusion was actually helping her cope with some very difficult circumstances in her life.
Interesting.
It gave her a sense of identity,
Right.
of purpose, of self-worth.
So instead of trying to shatter her illusion, he decided to work with it.
He did.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about condoning her delusion.
Right.
It was about understanding the role that it played in her life.
Okay.
He even compares it to this children's book, Madame Zelinsky and the King of Finland,
Okay.
where the main character tells these elaborate lies about her life. And her friends eventually realize that it's kinder to just go along with it than to try to expose her.
It makes you think about that fine line between supporting someone's coping mechanisms and enabling harmful behaviors.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And that's where Schwartzberg's wisdom as a clinician really shines through.
Yeah.
You know, he's not advocating for blind faith or denial.
Right.
He's advocating for a nuanced approach that recognizes the complexity of human experience,
Right.
especially in the face of a crisis like AIDS.
So where do we go from here?
Yeah.
What can we take away from these insights about coping mechanisms, about control, about the power of illusion? I feel like we've just scratched the surface of this book, and I'm eager to dive deeper.
There's definitely more to explore. And I think the key takeaway is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to coping with adversity.
Right.
You know, what works for one person might not work for another.
It's about finding your own path.
Right.
What helps you find meaning and resilience in the face of whatever challenges life throws your way.
Exactly. And remembering that it's a journey, not a destination.
Okay, let's continue this exploration. I want to hear more about how these men confronted their own mortality, how they dealt with the uncertainty of living with a disease that had no cure at the time.
That's a great place to pick up.
Yeah.
We'll delve into that next.
We were just talking about this idea of finding balance between acceptance and action. And it makes me think about how these men coped with the uncertainty of living with HIV. It was a death sentence for so many at the time. But they still had to live their lives day after day, not knowing what the future held. Did they just succumb to fear? Or were there ways that they tried to manage that anxiety?
Well, what's fascinating is that many of them tried to make the unknown knowable.
Okay.
Like this primal urge to impose order on chaos.
Yeah.
You know, Schwartzberg talks about how some men obsessed over pinpointing exactly when and how they contracted HIV, almost as if having a specific event or a particular person to blame would somehow give them a sense of control over this random occurrence.
It's like tracing that one thread back through the tapestry of your life, hoping it'll reveal some grand design. Did that actually bring them comfort, though?
It's hard to say for sure, but it seems like the act of searching for that answer, even if it was ultimately elusive, did give them a sense of agency.
Okay.
They were actively engaging with their diagnosis rather than passively accepting it.
And what about the future? Did they try to grapple with how much time they had left?
They did in some really interesting ways. One strategy was predicting their lifespan, almost like creating these artificial milestones to manage the anxiety of not knowing how long they had.
Okay.
They think in chunks of 5 years or 10 years, creating these self-imposed deadlines for living their lives.
Wow. That's both heartbreaking and inspiring at the same time. Did they talk about what they wanted to accomplish in those 5 or 10 years?
Some did. There were stories of men who quit their jobs to pursue their passions, who mended broken relationships, who traveled to places they'd always dreamed of seeing. It's like this stark awareness of their own mortality gave them a renewed sense of purpose, a clarity about what truly mattered.
It's like those deadlines, however artificial they might have been, force them to confront the big questions.
Right.
You know, what do I want my legacy to be? How do I want to spend the time I have left?
Exactly. And it wasn't just about individual goals. Many of them threw themselves into activism, fighting for better treatment, raising awareness, supporting others living with HIV. They found meaning in collective action, in fighting for a better future, even if they themselves might not live to see it.
That speaks to such a profound sense of community, a recognition that their individual struggles were part of a larger fight for justice and equality.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to that idea of HIV as belonging that we discussed earlier. Because for many of these men, their diagnosis wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a shared experience that bound them together.
It's like this devastating disease which sought to isolate and divide actually had the opposite effect. It forged these incredibly strong bonds within the gay community.
And it wasn't just about finding solace and support, it was also about taking action, about fighting back against the stigma and the discrimination and the indifference that fueled the epidemic.
Yeah, that's a powerful reminder that even in the face of such immense suffering, there's still room for hope, for resilience, for collective action.
And it's not just about activism. It's also about the smaller, everyday acts of courage and compassion.
Right.
You know, the friends who showed up, the families who offered support, the volunteers who cared for the sick and dying. Those acts of human connection were crucial in helping these men navigate the uncertainty and the fear.
You're right. Sometimes it's those small gestures, those moments of human connection that make all the difference.
Yeah.
It reminds me of something that Schwartzberg said about the importance of not going through this alone.
That's such a crucial point. Whether it's seeking out a therapist, joining a support group, confiding in a friend, or finding solace in your spiritual beliefs, connecting with others is essential.
Yeah, it's about acknowledging that you don't have to carry this burden alone. And it makes me think about the role of therapy in all of this. Was Schwartzberg advocating for a particular approach to therapy?
While he shared his own insights and approaches, Schwartzberg wasn't pushing any specific therapeutic agenda. He recognized that different people find different paths to healing and meaning, but there was one common thread that he emphasized. What's that?
The importance of honesty.
Honesty. So not just being honest with others, but also being honest with yourself.
Exactly. It's about facing the reality of your situation.
Yeah.
Your emotions, your fears, without judgment or denial. It's not about pretending everything is okay. It's about acknowledging the pain, the grief, the uncertainty as a way of reclaiming your power.
I can see how that ties back to those coping mechanisms that we were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
Because if you're not honest with yourself about what you're feeling,
Right.
you're more likely to rely on those unhealthy coping mechanisms that ultimately do more harm than good.
It's like those coping mechanisms become a way of avoiding those deeper truths, those uncomfortable emotions that we'd rather not face. But Schwartzberg argues that facing those truths, however painful they may be, is ultimately the path to healing and growth.
So honesty is the foundation.
But
what about action?
Yeah.
How did these men find a sense of agency in a situation that often felt completely out of their control? Well, Schwartzberg talks about the importance of finding those areas where you do have control, even when it feels like everything is falling apart.
Okay.
It might be as simple as taking care of your physical health, making healthy choices, sticking to a treatment regimen.
Right.
It might be about focusing on your emotional well-being, seeking out therapy, joining a support group, finding ways to express yourself creatively.
It's about reclaiming those small pockets of control, those areas where you can make choices that align with your values and goals, even when the larger picture feels overwhelming.
Exactly. It's about finding those small victories, those moments of agency that can fuel your resilience and give you a sense of purpose.
And what about the men who didn't find that sense of agency?
Yeah.
The ones who felt overwhelmed by the enormity of the crisis, who struggled to find meaning or hope?
Yeah.
Did Schwartzberg offer any guidance for them?
He did.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about offering easy answers or platitudes.
Okay.
It was about acknowledging the validity of their experience, the rawness of their pain. He recognized that there's no shame in feeling lost or confused or angry or despairing in the face of such a profound crisis.
It's like saying it's okay to not be okay.
Exactly. And that's often the first step towards healing. Because when you can acknowledge your own pain, your own vulnerability, you open yourself up to the possibility of connection, of support, of finding meaning in the midst of suffering.
And that brings us back to that powerful idea of HIV as belonging.
Yes.
That even in the darkest of times, human connection can be a source of strength and healing. It makes you wonder, how did these men grapple with the reality of living with HIV, knowing that it could potentially be a death sentence?
That's a powerful question, and it takes us right to the heart of the search for meaning.
Right.
Because facing your own mortality, the potential for suffering and loss, it forces you to confront the big questions.
Yeah.
What matters most? How do I want to live the time I have left?
Yeah.
What kind of legacy do I want to leave behind?
It's like suddenly everything is thrown into sharp relief.
It is. And for many of these men, living with HIV meant living with uncertainty. They didn't know how the disease would progress, how long they had, what the future held. It was this constant tension between hope and fear.
So how did they navigate that? What strategies did they use to cope with that level of uncertainty?
Well, Schwartzberg talks about this fascinating phenomenon of trying to make the unknown knowable.
Okay.
For example, some men tried to pinpoint exactly when and how they contracted HIV, almost as if having a specific event, a particular person to blame, would somehow give them a sense of control over this seemingly random occurrence.
It's like they were trying to impose order on chaos.
Exactly. And then there's this idea of predicting their lifespan, almost like creating these artificial milestones to manage the anxiety of not knowing how long they had.
Right.
You know, they would think in chunks of 5 years or 10 years, almost like these self-imposed deadlines for living their lives.
Wow. It's both heartbreaking and inspiring at the same time.
It is. And then there's the impact of witnessing others go through the stages of AIDS. It could be a source of anxiety,
Yeah.
but it could also be a way of preparing themselves, of learning from the experiences of those who had gone before. He talks about anticipatory grief, this idea of grieving for your own potential future loss.
It's like trying to rehearse for a reality that you hope will never come.
Exactly. And it speaks to the profound psychological impact of living with this disease.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't just about physical symptoms.
Right.
It was about this constant negotiation with mortality, with the unknown, with the very nature of life and death.
It's giving me chills just thinking about it.
Yeah.
It's one thing to grapple with those big existential questions in the abstract,
Right.
but it's quite another to have them thrust upon you in such a visceral way.
Absolutely. And what Schwartzberg captures so brilliantly is the way these men navigated that tension, that constant dance between hope and fear,
Yeah.
between acceptance and defiance.
We've talked a lot about the emotional and psychological impact of living with HIV,
Yeah.
but I'm curious about the practical side of things.
Yeah.
What did Schwartzberg have to say about the coping mechanisms that these men use to manage the day-to-day realities of their illness?
He delves into that as well. And it's fascinating how his insights as a therapist come into play here.
Okay.
He talks about how one of the most powerful tools for coping is acceptance, not denial.
So it's not about pretending everything is okay.
Right.
It's about acknowledging the reality of your situation, however difficult it may be.
Precisely.
Yeah.
He talks about how accepting your diagnosis, your limitations, your fears is often the first step towards finding a path forward.
It's about confronting the truth, even when it's painful, as a way of reclaiming your power.
Exactly. And he also emphasizes the importance of finding a balance between acceptance and action.
Okay.
Because while it's essential to acknowledge the things you can't control, like the progression of the disease,
Right.
it's equally important to focus on the things you can control, like your health habits, your attitude, your support system.
It's about finding that sweet spot between surrender and agency.
Right. And that's where problem-focused coping comes in.
Okay.
Because once you've accepted the reality of your situation,
Yeah.
you can start to take proactive steps to manage your health, to mitigate the impact of the disease.
So it's about taking charge of your well-being, even in the face of a serious illness.
Exactly. And Schwartzberg also talks about the importance of finding healthy ways to manage the emotional impact of the illness.
Okay.
You know, he encourages seeking out support groups, talking to a therapist, engaging in spiritual practices, finding creative outlets for expression.
It's about acknowledging the emotional reality of living with HIV and finding ways to process the fear, the grief, the uncertainty.
Exactly. And this brings us to another crucial aspect of coping, the importance of not going through this alone.
Yeah.
He stresses the value of connecting with others, whether it's family, friends, support groups, or therapists. Because when you're facing something as challenging as AIDS, having a sense of community, of shared experience of support can make all the difference.
That makes so much sense, because isolation only amplifies the fear and the pain.
Right. And I think that's one of the most powerful messages that emerges from this book.
What's that?
Even in the face of unimaginable suffering and loss, human connection is a vital source of strength and healing. It's about finding solace and shared experience and empathy in knowing that you're not alone in this journey.
And on that note of connection and healing, I think it's time to move on to the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much to explore. I'm especially curious to hear your thoughts on what we can learn from these stories, not just about AIDS, but about the human search for meaning in the face of any challenge.
I'm excited to delve into that with you.
You know, we've been talking about this crisis of meaning, that the AIDS epidemic brought on this profound struggle to find meaning in the face of loss and fear and uncertainty.
Right.
And it makes me wonder, what can we learn from these stories?
Yeah.
What insights can we apply to our own lives, even if we haven't personally faced something as devastating as AIDS?
That's the question that Schwartzberg really challenges us with in this book. And I think one of the key takeaways is that there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Okay.
There's no magic formula for finding meaning.
Right.
It's a deeply personal journey.
Yeah.
And what works for one person might not resonate with another.
It's like those 4 styles of adaptation that we talked about.
Right.
You know, some men found solace in their faith, while others turned to activism.
Yeah.
Some sought control, while others embraced surrender. You know, there's no right or wrong way to grieve, to cope, to make sense of loss.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that meaning isn't a fixed destination. It's an ongoing process, a constant dance between our inner world and the outer world.
Yeah.
And what brings us comfort and purpose might change over time as we grow and evolve.
So it's not about finding the answer. It's about staying open to the journey, to the possibility that our understanding of meaning might shift and change as we move through life.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about this idea of HIV as belonging.
Yeah.
How these men found strength and connection within the gay community as a result of this shared experience.
It's like this tragic, isolating disease actually had the opposite effect. It brought people together, forged these incredibly powerful bonds. Do you think there's a broader lesson there about the importance of community in times of crisis?
Absolutely. You know, we're social creatures. We need connection. We need to feel like we're part of something larger than ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's especially true when we're facing difficult times.
Right.
Whether it's a personal loss or a health crisis or a collective trauma, finding those sources of support, those spaces where we feel seen and heard, can make all the difference.
So it's not just about individual resilience, it's about collective resilience.
Exactly.
It's about recognizing that we're not alone in our struggles and finding strength in those connections.
And it's not just about receiving support.
Okay.
It's also about offering it. Schwartzberg talks about the countless acts of kindness and compassion that emerged during the AIDS crisis. The friends who showed up, the families who offered unconditional love, the volunteers who cared for the sick and dying.
It's those everyday heroes, those unsung acts of love and service that often make the biggest difference.
And you know, it's interesting to think about how those acts of giving or reaching out to others can also be a source of meaning.
Right.
When we focus on helping others, on making a positive impact, we shift our perspective away from our own struggles and we tap into something larger than ourselves.
It's like that old saying, the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others.
Exactly. And it makes me think about another theme that Schwartzberg touched on, the importance of embracing uncertainty.
Okay, that seems like a tough one.
Yeah.
How do you embrace uncertainty, especially when you're facing something as serious as a life-threatening illness?
It's not easy, but Schwartzberg argues that clinging to certainty, to the illusion of control, can actually make things harder.
Yeah.
Because life is inherently uncertain.
Right.
We don't know what the future holds.
Right.
And sometimes the best we can do is surrender to that unknown, to stay present in the moment, and to find ways to navigate the ups and downs with grace and courage.
I can see how that ties back to those men who tried to predict their lifespan. It's like they were seeking certainty in a situation that was inherently uncertain.
Right. And while there's nothing wrong with setting goals or making plans, I think Schwartzberg is suggesting that true peace comes from accepting that we don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
It's about letting go of the need to control everything and finding a way to be okay with not knowing.
It's a humbling thought, but it's also liberating in a way.
Yeah.
Because if we can let go of that need for certainty, we open ourselves up to possibilities and new ways of seeing the world, to a deeper understanding of ourselves and our place in the grand scheme of things.
Exactly. And that, to me, is the essence of what it means to find meaning. It's not about having all the answers. It's about being open to the questions. It's about embracing the unknown, the messy, the beautiful complexity of life.
And it's about remembering that we're not alone on this journey.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
And I think that's the perfect note to end on.
I couldn't agree more. This deep dive has been incredibly insightful, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. Thank you so much for guiding me through this exploration. And to our listener, thank you for sharing these powerful excerpts with us. We hope this conversation has given you some food for thought, some new perspectives, and perhaps even a renewed appreciation for the resilience of the human spirit.